Hello and welcome to the Spirit Box. So today is a different kind of podcast. What I'm sharing today is really a sample of the Plus show, extra content, and also some of the bonus content that happens on the podcast Patreon. And the reason I'm doing this is because I obviously want people to join the Patreon, but beyond that is really to give people a good idea of what they get should they decide to join up and support the podcast. So the first thing you're going to hear is stories about the Jinn from Egypt, shared by one of the podcast patrons, Gunter. And the second thing you're going to hear is an extract from one of the Plus shows of last year, which are also Jinn stories, shared by guest Mademoiselle Vendredi. And I think it was episode 33. Okay, I'm going to leave you with the Jinn stories. Enjoy. Take care and talk soon. Bye.
Hello, dear Dara. Hello, dear Patreons. Happy New Year 2021. So, my name is Günther and I'm from Austria. I travel a lot in Egypt. Like the last years, always in winter. I go there for at least 3 weeks or so because I don't like the winter here. And Egypt is a great country. I like the people there. I like the desert and I love the ocean. I love the Red Sea there. And I'm also very interested in mythical stories about Egypt and of course also Jinn stories. And most of the time I spend the days talking with people, like in the markets, with shop owners, with travel agents, and they're always willing to talk to strangers. They're very open-minded. Also, when it comes to paranormal stories and, of course, magicians, jinns, which are a big part of their culture and religious belief. And so I would say 90% are willing to talk about these stories, and everybody has one experience or more which they experience themselves or in the family. Some of them, like 10%, they say, oh yeah, Jinn do exist, but I don't talk about it. It's not allowed. Last year in winter, I stayed in Al-Qusir in a hotel, which is more or less a very ancient city. And there was this guy Jimmy working at a shop. And he was a Coptic Christian, and he also shared a fascination with Jinn stories. So every day I spent 2 hours sitting with him, drinking coffee, and he was telling me some strange but fascinating stories. So, for example, he's a Coptic Christian and he lives with his family in Nakada, which is in the province of Kenna. And the city of Nakada was also or is also known as a city of gold or golden city because they're very, very strange things happening because there are a lot of tombs and temples buried underneath the soil. And in his family, like his father is a school director, his mother is, I think, teacher or so. And underneath their house, they discovered that there is an ancient tomb, and supposedly there is a gold treasure buried. So they said, okay, we pay a company. They have to dig a tunnel, and then they try to get this treasure. So they were digging like 8 meters down, and soon they found a big stone which blocked the tunnel, which blocked their digging, and they say, okay, we reached this tomb. And the guys from the building company, they tried to remove it, and there were like, I don't know, 3 or 4 people down there, and suddenly Jimmy heard them screaming, help, help, somebody's attacking us. So, and Jimmy thought to himself, okay, they're just his workers down there, what's happening? And he and his father tried to rescue them, and they were completely shocked and said, oh no, there is a fucking Jinn down there, and he attacked us. So, and they all got like bruises and got really good punches in the face, and they say, okay, we stop working there. And Jimmy's father said, okay, I try to make contact to a sorcerer, to a magician who should get rid of this Jinn. So they found one, and he said, okay, let's check it out. And yes, there is a Jinn down there. He's guarding the tomb and the treasure. He's bound to this place, and he tries his best to remove him. So they put a rope around this sorcerer guy and let him down into the tunnel, and the guy said, okay, if something goes wrong, just pull the rope and pull me up. And it just took like, I don't know, like 2 or 3 minutes, and he was calling for help, and the sorcerer was he also got beaten up and said, oh no, this Jinn is too powerful, I can't do anything, so I'm done here. Good. So they tried to get another person, another sorcerer. This time I think it was a woman, but she also said this entity is too powerful, and she also said that a lot of people, also magicians, tried to get to this tomb and tried to deal with the Jinn, but all of them failed. And it's like with with computer games, there is an end boss and you fight him, and when you lose, also the boss gets experience and gets stronger with the time. So this Jinn down there, he was like a real end boss. So Jimmy's family, every now and then, they try to get somebody, but with no results. So they have their treasure underneath the house and they can't do anything. But then he said that I think this year they contacted a woman from Sudan, a magician. Sudanese magicians seems to be the most powerful ones. So they tried another time. Since this woman, she already was in their part of the city, which I told you before is famous for buried treasures, and Jimmy described it like this, that she made a type of spell. She was walking through the street, and with this spell, all unguarded treasures would show up by themselves. Like, you can imagine, like there was like a treasure chest just coming out of the sand into daylight. So, and this happened in a couple of places, which seems really crazy and made a lot of people rich. But what I heard from the stories, they were not happy rich people. So there always seems to be a kind of twist. So here we go. Next story is from Minna. He is also Coptic Christian, and he was the taxi guy. And he told me the story of a good friend who lives with his family also in the city of Kenna. And so the story is about this friend from Minna. I can't remember the name. But when his grandfather died, he gave him a magic book, a spell book. And he said, "This is my heritage to you, but don't use it." which sounds like an invitation. Don't use it, use it. So one time he got into a fight with his family. It was about money, and the guy was really pissed off and wanted to harm the people in the family, like not kill them, but like play a prank on them, and was looking like he found a spell in the book which make people believe that their house is burning. So the inhabitants of the home, they could see the fire, they could feel the heat, but no one else around. So he made this ritual and spell, and it happened exactly like this. His parents, his brothers, they saw the house is on fire, and they were trying to get water and were like taking buckets of water and tried to kill the fire. But the neighbors and all the people around, they say, "Oh, there's nothing wrong. They just have buckets with water, and they sprinkle the house with water." But for them it was a real fire, and they were completely in panic. So, and there was this guy who said, "Okay, somebody played like a terrible prank on you. The house isn't on fire." So, fascinating story of how you can somebody make believe that your house is on fire. A common theme with Islam, Sufi mystics, and magicians is mind reading. So they know what you think. There is the story of Muhammad. He's an engineer in Cairo. And he told me that he was once at a party in Cairo, talking with friends. Then he went outside to smoke a cigarette and was thinking about the project. Like, it was a project in his head, a building project. And suddenly a guy comes up on the street and says, "You're Muhammad Ashraf. These are your parents' name, and you live in this city. And what you now think in your head, don't do it. Don't do the project. Do you understand?" Muhammad said yes, and the guy went away. So I heard similar stories from like 4 or 5 occasions. Also, when somebody goes to see a mystic or magician, like sometimes they already know in advance that you're coming and who you are. And yeah, also when they live in the desert and they know that tomorrow at 2 o'clock in the afternoon there is this and this guy coming and he wants this and this. But it's not like somebody told them, they just know it. So this is a very common theme, mind reading. Another story from Jimmy, where he talked about how he built a house with friends, like for his cousin, and they made a 3 stories building. And there was also a friend with them who is commonly known that he works with jinns and also hosts 6 or 7 jinn entities in his body. Like he shares the body with 6, 7 other entities, which sounds very creepy, but yeah, that's the way it is. And of course, people avoid him, and he lives out in the desert. But he helped them building the house. And one day, Jimmy got curious and asked him, can you make me see the Jinn? And the guy said, no, no way. But he really begged for it. He said, oh, come on, I really want to see them. He said, okay, I cannot make you see them, but I can make you feel them. Jimmy said, okay, better than nothing. And suddenly he told me he really felt the presence of entities also when they were walking by him, and he was really shocked and scared of the presence of these jinns. Like he also felt like it was really cold, and yeah, I think it was the last time he asked him about the jinns. But this guy also helped them with building the house, and there was the situation at one point there was only Jimmy and him, and they had the first story finished from the building, and they had like a lot of bricks, and they had to carry it on top so they can make the second story. And he said, okay, this will take us like 2 days to carry all the bricks up there. And the guy said to Jimmy, just go for a walk. Don't come here for the next 30 minutes, and I see what I can do. So Jimmy said, okay, I'm going for a walk. And half an hour later, he came back. So all the bricks were up there, which normally would have taken them 1 or 2 days. So he knew that he asked his jinns to help him carry them up, the bricks. And also another story of Jimmy and this guy when they were traveling. They went somewhere in the desert, and the car broke down, and it was a really lonely road, so nobody stopped there and said, okay, let's wait. And they wanted to drink something, and the guy suddenly called Jimmy and said, look, I have tea. And they didn't have equipment for fire or a teapot or tea, but somehow he made a fire appear and a teapot with tea and 2 cups and sugar. Yep.
Now, we spoke a little bit about your background. Obviously, we won't go into uh, any detail, but we've been talking through, say, the geographical area where you're historically from, um, being the Middle East. Are you comfortable with me going through this?
Yes, yes, of
Yeah.
course, yes. No
Um,
problem.
Now, as we've established, um, I've got an interest, and I've been researching into the Jinn and
Mm-hmm.
the kind of folk Islam around the Jinn.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned you have some methods of how to rid oneself of the Jinn, and of course some Jinn stories, which I'd love to explore with you.
Okay. Well, I have to say, the methods I know of, and they're granted there aren't many methods particularly applicable to the Jinn, which I know of. However, these ones that I did learn were many, many years ago when I was still very young, and they were taught to me sort of not in a sort of a formal context. In fact, if anything, they were sort of, I remember one conversation with a friend's mother where she sort of just casually came out with sort of as if she were telling us a fairy tale. It was very weird. I remember we were sitting, I was at my friend's house, and her mother she was always talking about the Jinn. I don't know why. She just liked to talk about them. It was sort of her main topic of conversation. She felt inexplicably comfortable talking about it with me. So she sort of started talking about ways in which one could rid oneself of the presence of a Jinn. And one of the things I do remember her telling me, I have to say, she really said this in such a casual way. It was as if she went from talking about what to buy next week in her weekly shopping list to Jinn. It's sort of that sort of conversation. It switched very quickly. And
Right.
yeah, so she what if I can remember correctly, I want to get this right because she mentioned I think it was two surahs from the Quran, and one of them was definitely the Ayat al-Kursi, the throne verse, I believe. And she actually showed me the method. What she did was she would say the surah into her palms, the way in which Muslims usually pray, which is with both arms in supplication to Allah in front of her, and she would say the surah, and then she would blow the surah, as it were, into her palms, and then pass her hands from her head all the way down to her knees, in sort of like a sweeping motion. And
Okay.
I had actually seen her do that a few times. One particular time I remember she did it, and I asked her why she was doing it, was when we were getting into her car and she was driving her daughter and me, I don't know where we were going, somewhere. And she did this sort of little ritual, as it were, where she held up her hands in supplication, said her surahs, and then blew physically into her palms and then passed her hands over her body. And I asked her, I said, what are you doing? And she said, oh, I'm just getting ready for our journey. We're going to, I don't know where we were going, probably the pizza place down the road. And she said the prayer, and it wasn't so unusual for me. Obviously, growing up in the Middle East, you see people reciting surahs or prayers to themselves all the time. But the physical action, I'd never seen anybody do that before. And I asked her why, and she said, well, it's to make sure that the Jinn know that this body is protected. And I was like, oh, okay. And I never really thought about it after that. Most of the Jinn stories I actually have are connected in some way to this particular woman. And I don't know why. I don't know, maybe she just sort of had a penchant for Jinn. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. This there's two interesting bits to what you've just relayed to me. I mean, one interesting bit is I mentioned earlier about Aidan Wachter on the show a couple
Mm,
of weeks ago. One of the rituals he outlines in his book Six Ways is what he calls like cutting the luminous threads or luminous cords that
mm.
beings might have to you. And it's kind of an
Yes.
idea that he's unpacked from Carlos Castaneda in one of his books. I can't recall which one, but it involves not the surah element or a version of the surah element, but it involves the kind of the physical sweeping of your hands down the body
Mm,
to cut those connections, which is quite interesting. And when the other bit was when you think about kind of how intrusion is believed to happen, how Jinn or spirits or fairies or whatever get into people, that
mm,
it happens through energy leakage in the bodies where through traumas that there's a breakdown in the kind of the etheric bodies, and there's an entry point through which an entity can get a foothold. And I think those sweeping motions down around the body, are a way to reinforce
mm.
or in some way kind of deal with any energy leakages or whatever that might be. I don't know, but it's interesting that
Mm.
that's this almost kind of the same motion you
Yes.
described.
You mentioned actually something really interesting just there, and it's something which I remember being told. Again, I can't place exactly when, but it was quite a long time ago, and it came about through another conversation, obviously with somebody, but I don't remember who. And they said that Jinn, according to this person and what they believed in and their version of Islam and their interpretation, that the Jinn they enter us through our mouths, our ears, and also our eyes. And I remember that
Mm.
that always stuck with me. How do they go through your eyes? And actually, if you read, I think if you read some sources, especially if you read from an Islamic point of view, there are a lot of books written by sheikhs that say that points of entry, how to avoid the jinn
Mm-hmm.
being possessed by jinn, how they enter through you. And the mouth is obviously one which is spoken of a lot. The ears I've seen, the eyes, I've never seen that anywhere else. So I don't know if this person just had an experience with a
Mm-hmm.
particular jinn that just went through his eyes, or maybe what they meant was that when you look upon the jinn in their form, in their visible form, that they are more easily able to uh, penetrate you as a body.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then that's just sort of always stuck with me because I always thought, okay, mouth, yes, ears, okay,
Mm-hmm.
eyes, yeah. Um, but I mean, I have to say, the jinn are really very fascinating. But and there's a layer of scholarly fascination whereby the names of jinn have been recorded and their various attributes and so forth. But then, like you said, there is very much a folk element, a very base, very primal element of them, which defies any sort of containable explanation. You can't just say this is what jinn are and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
There's seemingly endless explanations for what they may be.
Have I lost you?
No, I'm still here.
No. Um, yeah, it is a catch-all term. I think
Mm,
that's it. There's, I mean, when you go through, I guess the kind of compendium of gin that people have catalogued over the years and defined over the years, from the kind of ghoul to the ifrit, down to the
mm,
marid and quite complex concepts like the quinar,
mm-hmm.
that the double,
Yes.
where that kind of ties into the idea of your personal daemon, um, or guardian angel, even like there's a lot there when you start to kind of pull it apart, and For me, I guess the fascination was where I sort of see the same themes come up again and again in different locations in the world.
Mm.
But the Jinn was kind of the entry point for me with a lot of this. In one of the stories that you shared with me on Insta, you mentioned a tree that had ribbons tied to it.
Oh,
Um,
yes.
yeah. So we have the exact same thing in Ireland. They're called clootie trees,
Okay.
and people tie ribbons and rags to them. And usually it's a form of bargain that the knot in the ribbon represents an
Oh, I
agreement
see.
in that kind of,
Okay.
you grant me this, I'll do X. Um, and in a site I was at in Delhi called Feroz Shokolta,
Hmm.
around supplicants would give like sweets and various different elements to the sites represented or associated with the Jinn, but they would also use padlocks to tie. Again, the same bond. The lock represents the bargain being sealed um, all over the place, which is interesting because you see a lot of kind of young couples do that kind of thing on bridges and stuff all over Europe um, with their initials on it, but lock the
Indeed.
yeah.
Yes. That's really fascinating. I'll be honest, I don't know where the idea of tying ribbons came from with this particular tree in mind. I can tell you the story though, and it really is quite an exciting one, or as exciting as these stories can get.
Awesome.
Um, Actually, no, there are actually a few more stories I could tell you, which really would raise the hairs off the back of your neck.
Well,
Um,
I want all of them.
okay, well, this one is in relation to the tree, and that is that it's just, I want to make it clear that even though jinn are feared for the most part by most devout Muslims, there's then they are spoken with a certain grudging respect. There's that tone about them that, you don't disturb them. And I'll come to a few stories of specific places where that was the case. So, on the one hand, you have the official uh, uh, Islam that tells you how the jinn fit into the Islamic perspective of the universe. And then you have this sort of very real, very personable, for lack of a better word, relationship that the everyday Muslim encounters with the jinn. So to that end, the tree, this was a story which was related to me, oh goodness, I don't even want to think about how many years ago it was. And of course I was still living in the Middle East at the time. This tree stood um, in the middle of nowhere, actually, and that's saying something considering this was a desert place. But the tree stood there for a very long time, and it had little knots or little pieces of sort of torn rags attached to it or tied to its branches. The tree itself just looked like a dead uh, tree. I don't even know what type of tree it was, but I remember where it was. It was just outside of the city I grew up in. And people would always say that you were never to go near the tree, lest you make the jinn who surrounded it and protected it angry. And it was just a story that people used to tell. It wasn't like some people said it because they really believed that you shouldn't go there, and others just said it sort of like as a bit of a joke. Oh, don't go near that tree because it's going to curse you. But most people sort of treated it with a sort of a, a, a respect at a distance, shall we say. And this tree stood there for the longest time. But, and then even when they started modernizing and building in that area, they were very cautious and wary of removing the tree. And I do remember hearing, I never experienced it myself, unfortunately, I wasn't there, but I heard that they had employed some jinn masters. Now, I don't use the word magician here because I've never encountered any Muslims that would call them jinn magicians. They would just call them either jinn masters or Jinn shakes, which sounds a bit odd to our ears, but that's
Yeah.
just what they called it. And they employed Jinn masters to do whatever they needed to do to rid the Jinn, or the locality, the area of the Jinn that resided near the tree. And then after that, the tree was removed, and it's since been built over, and I don't know what's there now, but that tree has remained in my memory for all these years. It's such a fascinating story because it's so tied to the local beliefs, not just of Jinn, but of the spirits of, I suppose you could call them the genus loci that
Yeah.
live there. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that you should mention that kind of story, because I was talking about that the Irish equivalent not that long ago with a previous guest, um, in relation to the whitethorn tree in Ireland. The whitethorn tree is very much seen as a taboo tree. You do not
Mm.
damage the whitethorn. It's associated with the good people, and they'll wreak havoc on you if you do transgress. And in the 90s, there was a case in County Clare where there was a very old whitethorn, and developers were planning, I believe it was a road to go through the area, and a local who's quite famous now, Shanachie, which is like a old storyteller, basically started a protest about cutting down the tree, in that it had significant value folklorically, but also, saying that you will really piss off the good
Mm.
people, and they will extract their price because of it. But it's from memory, I think it stopped the road being developed. It may have made
Mm.
the national. It made international news, if I
Goodness.
recall correctly. But it's very similar. Um,
Yes.
um, and so I think, kind of going through that, then you also mentioned the going through the other stories, rather. You mentioned the Sheik's abandoned palace.
Ah, yes. This one is the good one. Um, this again is, it's sort of uh, the palace itself is still there, or what remains of it is still there, and we're not talking about sort of a crumbling old palace. I believe the palace was constructed in the 80s, at the end of the 80s, I believe. I think I'm trying to sort of get my timeline right. Yes, end of the 80s. And that particular sheikh, in the way things are in the Middle East, bigger is better and grander and more opulent. It's just sort of that mentality of
Mhm.
showing off what one has. And of course, if one is a sheikh, then one must really show what one has. And the palace was constructed. But the story goes that the sheikh himself didn't ask permission uh, of the local tribe, or the remains of the tribe that lived in that area. I don't think they live there anymore. They've since really modernized since then. And I use that word not not really in the best way possible. I mean, they were modernized because they were forced to modernize.
Right.
Um, so the story goes that obviously the sheikh hadn't, sort of in his arrogance, had assumed, no, I will build my palace right here. And the first night which he moved in, this is how the story, and there are variations of the story, but it's quite dramatic. The first night he moved in was his last. He, according to the legend, he woke up in the middle of the night, freezing cold, and his bed had been transported to outside the palace grounds. And it's just, you think about it, you think, well, how is that possible? But then we're talking about the Jinn here.
Yeah.
And in many of the old stories we have, especially in the Alf Layla wa Layla, the 1001 Nights, we have the story of how the Jinn was commanded to bring, oh, I can't remember the name of the character, was able to bring the character with his bed to another location instantly.
Hmm.
I wish I could remember the story. Um, and in this case, this is what apparently happened. The sheikh woke up in the middle of the night, freezing cold, because the desert gets freezing at night.
Mhm.
Um, and he realized he was outside in his night clothes, in his bed. And the story goes that he ran off, and he never spent another night in the palace again. And it still stands today, the palace. It's been, I believe it's been gutted.
Mm.
And it's just basically a shell now. But people, locals and expats alike, are still wary of the story, and people don't go there.
Yeah.
They do have a guard. I read recently, as recent as about 5-6 years ago, some team of ghost investigators, whatever you want to call them, decided that they would go in. I don't think they were from, in fact, I know they weren't from the city. They were from, I think they came from abroad, and they
Right.
came to check it out because they'd heard the stories. And there was a guard there, and I remember reading about this and how they were told that they could go in, but at their peril. Whether
Yeah.
they came out again was completely, up to them, up to the Jinn rather.
Oof. I mean, I do think a lot of that paranormal investigation is
Mm,
it really is stepping into, a lot of people are stepping into a world they don't understand at all.
mm,
Um, and like, they often get punished for it. Either directly or indirectly. It doesn't
mm.
always pan out for people. And to keep the stories going, I love all this.
So many stories, so many.
I'm a folklorist at heart. Mentioned your friend's encounter with a Jinn at the side of a desert
Oh
village.
yes. This one really does. It gives me chills just talking about it. I wasn't even there, but this was a very, very good friend of mine. She's from Pakistan originally, and of course, Pakistan has a very rich history of Jinn legends,
Mhm.
which also sort of have been combined with the pre-Islamic existence of Jinn in that geographic location. It's really fascinating. Um, she told me this story, and I have to say, she is a Muslim. However, she's more of the belief that Jinn are. She takes a more modern approach, if you can call it that. She sort of describes the Jinn as being aspects of our untapped mind. She looks at it very much from a psychoanalytical point of view, seeing the Jinn as sort of aspects of our own consciousness. I don't know. She goes on a lot about it. She and I say that actually because she's not one to easily be frightened by the more traditional classical stories or images of the Jinn. However, this was something she told me about 10 years ago. And actually, I had met her the next day after this encounter supposedly had happened.
Mhm.
There are many highways in the city that I grew up in, because there was so much fast development definitely at the end of the 80s, all through the 90s. There was just so much construction going on. And a lot of the highways, when you think of a highway, you think of it, okay, yeah, it's not in the middle of the city. Obviously, it's connecting points, but, you're going to see things. However, these highways were constructed quite literally in the middle of a desert.
Right.
And, they would stretch for miles, and in both directions to either side of you, you would see nothing but desert dunes. And so she told me this one story where she was driving back from work, and her work was based quite far out of the city at the time. And she had to take one of these newer highways. And she was driving along, and it was quite late at night. She worked ridiculous hours. And she said that she saw someone walking on the side of the highway. And the person was dressed in the traditional garb of an Islamic woman of that area, all sort of covered head to toe in black. And that itself is not an odd sight. What was odd was that it was the middle of the night, and there was nothing around. It was just sort of the desert.
Mm-hmm.
And so, of course, my friend, being the type of person she is, she stopped. It was the middle of the night. It's not exactly the safe place for anybody to be, let alone a woman. And when she stopped her car, she sort of motioned the woman to come over. And she describes it as an intense, prickly sensation all over her body. And she just knew in that moment that she'd done the wrong thing. She shouldn't have stopped. And I remember when she told me this, I was getting goosebumps all over me. In fact, I am a little bit now, because the story sort of had such an impact on me. And she said, she called to the woman in Arabic, and she called her madam, or whatever the word is. And the thing is, now this is where it all gets very surreal. The woman was facing away from her, so she had her back to her. Now that's important for the story, because when she called her name, called the lady to come to her to offer her a lift, the lady appeared to turn her head, but this is actually very odd to describe, but she turned her head, but her scarf remained on her head. So she turned her head 180 degrees, or that's what it seemed like, and her face, or what looked like her face, was appearing out the back of the headscarf. So if you imagine someone standing in front of you and you call them, and instead of turning around fully, they just turn their head, except for we cannot turn our heads quite that far. And yet, apparently, this woman looked like she did. And my friend absolutely lost it. She ran back to her car and she got in and just drove off. And I met her the next day, and she was in a state of high agitation. And she said, I think I just encountered a Jinn. And then she told me the story. What's really interesting, and this is where it really gets fun, if that weren't fun already, we found out a little later from various people who knew the area or knew that particular stretch of road, that wasn't the first time she had appeared, this Jinn, apparently. Apparently there were stories, legends of her going around, that she had appeared to a number of people, always at night, and always that strange, I don't know how to explain it, but basically she turned her head 180 degrees without actually moving. Like, her head moved, but it was still within the confines of the scarf. Very, very bizarre. And it's a great story to tell to people, especially when they know nothing about Jinn and they think it's all about Disney's representation of in Aladdin.
Yeah.
You tell them that story and they sort of, lose it.
Like, oh, okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, it's incredible stuff, and there does seem with these beings, these spirits, whatever they are, something to do with the highway. Again, old fairy legends in Ireland are you meet the man in black along the road, which is kind of a devil type trickster figure. And generally it doesn't go well. Either people run away, as your friend quite wisely did, or they end up having some sort of bargain they can't keep, or a warning of some description. Anyway, a lot of them end quite badly in folklore anyway. But there definitely seems to be something about the kind of the traveling at night that is opens exposure to these things.
I mean, it has to be said, sorry to interrupt, it has to really be said that, of course, anything that is sort of a spiritual nature is not something to be, messed with. But in particular, the Jinn have a very fierce reputation, both from an Islamic and scholarly point of view, the way they are treated, but also the way in which they appear, and the type of havoc they can really cause in one's life if they are messed with. There are also stories of where Jinn don't need to be provoked, but then in that case you do have folk Islamic ways of removing them. Something which I did learn, sorry I didn't mention it earlier, the very basic utterance of the phrase Bismillah. For most Muslims, that is supposedly enough to rid a room which you enter, or wherever you are. If you say the words Bismillah, which in Arabic translates as to in the name of God, that is enough to rid them. Another phrase which I actually learned was the other, I think it's one of the 5 pillars of Islam, which is La ilaha illallah, which means there is no God but God. And I have known of people who use that phrase as well as the first phrase, Bismillah, when they feel scared, shocked, where they
Mm.
believe that a Jinn has infested a place. So those two words are used for warding them away. Yeah.
Right.
So they have quite this reputation of being quite meddlesome, and really to the point where it's not funny, for us.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, no, it's exactly the same with fairy lore, and so many things were attributed to fairies getting involved in people's lives, or going anywhere close to old kind of rats or fairy rings, meant trouble, particularly at night, you know, and
Mm.
and then people used to use fairy doctors to help them kind of unravel any of the issues they got themselves into.
Mm.
But you had also two of the bits you mentioned.
You just want all the stories,
I
don't you?
do. Yeah. I love this stuff, but I've got that frame in my head where I'm like just gather as much information as you can and look for the themes, and but they're there, they're there, and where they correlate with the likes of fairy lore. There's just so much with the Jinn and fairies that is almost the same,
Mm.
like the type of Jinn who have relationships with human beings, who have like sexual relationship with human beings, in that kind of incubus and succubus type.
Yes.
Exact same thing exists in fairy lore. It's called Lanashi,
Mm.
which is kind of a predatory female spirit who will go after uh, men and have relationships with them. You know, um, that sexual interest thing is there in the spirit world. There definitely is something to that, and you can kind of pull that thread and end up in kind of modern UFOlogy and again
Yeah.
kind of the sexual interest that alien beings, whatever they are, have with human beings as well. There's all these themes just all seem to kind of are interwoven. I mean, it's a great big bowl of spaghetti. You're trying to pull one thread out and try and look at
Yeah.
them, and it's very, very almost impossible to kind of really interrogate it. So it's so
Mm.
broad. But like, even like we were talking about the kind of Bishmillah around blessing a room, and like again within Irish folklore, the use of prayer and blessing and God bless you, and the use of invoking God and Jesus all the time, like in the even in greeting in Gaelic is Diagwich, means God be with you, and the response to that is Diasmirgwich, which is like God and Mary be with you, so it's always the same thing. So it's the same thing as Bismillah. It's kind of like God be with you, God be with you, God be with you. And it's the context for that, when you look at it through the folklore, the context of that is to protect you from the random intervention and obstruction and trickstery of the devil and of the fairies. And in this
Mm.
case, you just transpose that to a different geological location or geographical location, and you have the same, again, fear of the Jinn. And it's using the things of Bishmillah just as preventative measures to keep the kind of
Mm.
boundary safe. And that's that kind of fear of the random intervention is very different from incurring the wrath, but some of the taboos are almost identical, like the whole idea of like throwing wastewater out of the house, that saying Bismillah as a warning to any Jinn that are there that you might injure through throwing wastewater out of the house. Exact same taboo existed in rural Ireland,
Mm. The
and just
connections are fascinating.
they really are. I mean, that's kind of where I just go, I get really kind of start stroking my chin beyond belief, go, what, really? That is well? um, but to go back to your story, you mentioned there was a deserted apartment and then helping clearing homes and Jinn possession.
Mm. Um, the deserted building. Yes, I mean this sort of runs along the same lines as the palace story, which I
Yeah.
just recounted. Except this one this one is, I should say, because it's still there as far as I know. Um, is a building that was only really constructed. It was only constructed very recently, in the last 20 years, and it was a housing complex, or building, I should say. And I just, there were stories always going around that that building had stayed abandoned, or hadn't sold, or hadn't been let for that amount of time. 20, I can't remember, maybe 10 years. It had sort of lain empty, without any occupants. And the story was that the Jinn had moved in. That was it. And this building we have, it's like, you're in the city center doing your shopping, and there it is. There's the building. It doesn't look like a creepy old mansion. It definitely doesn't look like an abandoned palace. It's just your average regular building. I believe there was maybe one shop or two at the bottom of this big building, but other than that, the entire building was just completely empty. And the story always went that the Jinn had moved in, and it was just accepted truth, that either they would have to employ a Jinn sheikh, or a sheikh, to come in and get rid of them, or it was just left. And for whatever reason, the property developer just left it. It's a curious story, mainly because if you were to go into that part of the city today, you wouldn't give the building a second glance. You wouldn't. I mean, I used to go past it all the time when I was working. I would walk past it sometimes and look in as much as one could. You could peer through the gates. It didn't have any sort of feeling about it. Maybe it wasn't the Jinn, but the overwhelming legend of it, this building that stands right in the center of the city, is infested with Jinn. It's quite a story. And then people would talk about it occasionally, if we were, I remember one time someone bringing it up while we were having coffee. I don't know why they started talking about it. And there it was. Yeah. So that is the deserted building in the center of the city where I grew up. Trying to remember, what else did I tell you about? I can't remember.
There's clearing homes from the Jinn, and then Jinn possession.
Ah, yes. Okay. The Jinn possession stories. Okay. Well, again, these sort of stories came about just sort of in very casual conversation. I have to make that point clear, because for most people who didn't grow up in an Islamic either background, or culturally, they didn't grow up in that sort of atmosphere, might find it strange that Jinn are spoken about so often, or that just people accept their reality so willingly. Not everybody, like my friend, for example, but most people, when you say Jinn, they will usually say a quick, Bismillah, and then they will just accept that your story is the truth. Because to not accept the Jinn, according to some very devout Muslims, is to be un-Islamic. It is un-Islamic to not accept the Jinn, because the Prophet Muhammad spoke about them quite a lot.
Yeah.
So the story of Jinn possession, these are two little sort of small stories. One of them being that I was working in a place, this was a number of years ago, and one of the colleagues got ill. Nothing unusual about that, except that after about 2 weeks, I believe, she still wasn't turning up for work, and obviously the boss was getting a little bit irate. And then, of course, stories started circulating, all sorts of nefarious stories that she was having an affair and all sorts of stuff. Just people gossiping at work.
Right.
And it transpired after about 3 weeks that she really was very ill. And I didn't know the person particularly well, but I knew somebody who knew her. And he said that he'd been over to visit her, and she was, for lack of better expression, she was completely out of her mind. What I mean to say by that is that she was acting as if she had mental problems.
Right.
She was speaking to herself. Her family didn't know what to do with her. And her family were Muslim, as far as I know, but they weren't devout, every Friday at the mosque type Muslims. Um, and yet, I did hear a couple of months later, because she never returned to work, I had heard they'd employed a Jinn master to come and exorcise her because they believed that she was possessed of a Jinn, or several actually. And that's pretty much where the story ends. We never knew what happened to her. I believe she went abroad for medical treatment, but we never heard from her again. And it's a little bit of a sad story because from the human point of view, obviously she's a person. Something like that is going to be distressing for anybody.
Yeah,
But the
absolutely.
absolute acceptance from most people that she had been possessed by a Jinn, and that the only way to alleviate her condition was to bring in a Jinn master, just absolutely fascinating. So that's the one story. The other story is actually very similar, except it actually happened to a friend of mine. This friend of mine was someone who I knew fairly well. And they started exhibiting the same symptoms. They were getting very stressed for no reason, very tired, which was very odd considering they were a bit of a health nut. They were always at the gym and sort of, working out and all that stuff. And just, it was remarkable. Within the space of a weekend, I remember clearly because I saw them, they just deteriorated. And of course, the first reaction anyone usually has in that context is to tell that person to go to hospital, get some tests. And so my friend did. In fact, I accompanied him to the hospital. I didn't go in with him, but I accompanied him.
Right.
The doctors, I think they just chalked it up to vitamin deficiency or something rather like that was affecting his energy, his levels of energy, something to do with his insulin. But he went for a second opinion with some other doctors. He just felt like something was wrong, and he did end up going to a psychologist, and he eventually overcame it. But when we spoke about it a couple of years later, that whole episode in his life, he said, for the life of me, I don't know what happened. One day I was fine and fit. The next day I was, I couldn't think. And he described, actually, this is what really made me sort of sit up and really listen to what he was saying and think it was the Jinn, maybe, because he was talking about how he felt invaded. Maybe invaded is not the right word. He felt as if something was within him, and that thing was sort of trying to expand. Does that sound right?
Right. Okay. Yeah.
He felt as if he were being subsumed by something, and he said it was the most unpleasant sensation he'd ever had. And I mean, a couple of years later now, and he can talk about it freely and almost laugh it off as if it were nothing. But when it was happening to him, it was actually quite frightening.
Sure.
Yeah. So those were those two particular instances, and again, this particular person, this friend of mine, he's got nothing to do, or at least I don't think he does have anything to do with the occult or magic. At one point, I thought perhaps he had somebody who was working some magic against him, which is obviously, of course, likely. It could have been someone doing something to him. But the way in which he described the feelings, the sensations of being invaded, of being completely subsumed by something that felt as if it wanted to get out, as it were, led me to think that it might have been the Jinn. So yeah, really curious stories.
I mean, it could have been both. Someone using magic to send the Jinn against him.
It's very likely. It's very likely. I mean, that, by the way, I have to say, that sort of threat, shall we say, you say that to any Muslim that is in any way inclined towards their spirituality, that usually incurs a lot of rapid bismillahs and la ilaha illallahs in order to counteract whatever you said. Even if you say it as a joke, oh, I'm going to send the jinn on you. You know, it's sort of the equivalent of when my Catholic friends hear me say something like, oh, I'm going to put a curse on you. They'll start crossing themselves furiously. You know, it's that sort of belief. Yeah, it was a very odd, it was really, really odd watching him go through that episode.
Yeah, it sounds like quite a challenging time. And it's such a tricky balance to get right, isn't it? Between kind of, is this a spiritual issue or is it a mental health issue? You know, and I've heard a lot of practitioners who work in this space, you know, they really are conscientious of that. They're conscientious of how, you know, the symptoms of things like was are almost, you know, identical to various different mental health issues, and it's easy to see how one can get mistaken for the other. So it's so important that people take medical treatment, you know, medical examination as well with these issues. What was I going to ask you as well? Yes, the evil eye and the amulets that are used to thwart the evil eye.
Well, the evil eye is it's very big business in the Middle East, as you can imagine. I grew up learning to call it, well, we called it the evil eye, obviously, in English. I learned to call it the Nazar, Nazar, or the Buri Nazar, as some people used to say it. That was actually a term I learned from my Pakistani friends. Some Arabs who I was friendly with when I was very young, they used to sometimes refer to the ain, which means eye in Arabic. No evil eye, just eye.
What's the term?
The word is ain. It's
Ain.
with yes. So phonetically in English, you'd write it as AIYN, but it has sort of a funny little sound in the middle of it, it's like a discorded sound. So it's ain.
Ain.
Yes, that's right. There we go. And well, I mean, what is there to say? I mean, alongside the jinn, I would say that the evil eye is just as notorious and also feared throughout the Middle East. The evil eye charm, which can be seen everywhere. I mean, everybody seems to have an evil eye charm. The blue eye. I remember seeing that everywhere I went. People had it in their houses, or people would wear it as jewelry. And it actually didn't matter, because I had friends who were Christian and I had friends who were Muslim. Obviously, I had some Hindu friends as well. And, you know, it's sort of transgen. No, what's the word I want to use here? Oh, it's sort of,
it's interfaith, isn't it?
There we go. Yeah. I don't even know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
The word came to me and then it disappeared. Anyways, it's sort of, yes, everybody, it doesn't matter what religion or faith you were, carrying the evil eye or carrying the amulet of the evil eye was supposedly to protect you against any type of evil eye. It doesn't matter if it came from a Muslim, a Hindu, or whatever. One particular thing I used to remember, in fact, you can still see it, and possibly I'm sure you saw it when you went to India, is that at the doorway of a shop or a supermarket, if it's a Hindu establishment or business, very often you will see a couple of chilies and possibly a lime hanging up in the door. Yeah. And that is a protective charm against the evil eye. And it's such a commonplace thing throughout the Middle East, and then obviously the subcontinent, that you don't, when you grow up seeing it all the time, it's sort of, it just is. And yet when I encountered it in other countries, it actually was like, you know, startling. It was like, oh, okay, you're doing it here as well.
And I was reading about this in kind of the Irish Folklore Library. It was again prevalent in rural Ireland as well, but particularly for animals, and the idea of the kind of covetous eye could,
Yes.
stop a cow producing milk, that kind of thing. And
Mm.
there were like two cures for it listed in this, which was to get a tiny piece of cloth from the clothing of the person who cast the eye, who may not even know they've done it, and to burn it, and let the cow, is always a cow, inhale the smoke, would be a cure. The other bit is to write the letters of the alphabet and to burn them in front of the cow's mouth and let them inhale the smoke, and that would help cure them of the affliction. Um, which I've done. quite an interesting cure, but there you go. I'm not sure it works, but one
That's
for your
interesting.
back pocket.
Exactly. No, that's really interesting because you say that about writing words and such. Um, One very popular method, which I have definitely seen firsthand many times, it's not so much of a method; it's an amulet. And if you are a Muslim, you can go to a sheikh. In this case, obviously, a sheikh sort of means a holy man, I guess.
Yeah.
Or you can go to a mullah in the mosque, and they will construct something for you called a taweez.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not a scholar on this subject at all, so forgive me if I actually get it completely wrong, but this is what I've observed and what I've been told from friends who are Muslim. And the taweez is basically a set of surahs or passages from the Quran, which have been written out by the mullah, and then certain other elements are put in. I don't even know what that is. I suppose your name, calling your name and also your father's name is a very big thing in the Middle East. You use your father's name in order to call your name. It's like a word of power. So son of, for
Right.
example, that might be inscribed into it. And then usually it was a piece of paper, or sometimes it would be a sheet of metal. I've encountered more the paper variety, and then it's simply folded up, blessed by the mullah, and then you wear it. And a friend of mine actually has one. She wears one constantly. Usually, the piece of paper is put inside like a locket, or actually, if you go. I don't know if you'd call it an Islamic jewelry shop, but a shop where they sell Islamic jewelry. And you can actually buy specific lockets that will have Quranic inscriptions on them, and then they'll have a little opening where you can put the taweez in. Hmm.
How interesting. I didn't realize that there's actual types of jewelry that cater for it. That's really interesting. How cool. So I'm aware that I've extracted every possible story that I can get from you. I really appreciate your time. It's been
It's been
fantastic talking to
enjoyable.
you. Oh, awesome! I'm delighted. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
And thank you
Um,
very much for having me.
it's been an absolute pleasure. It's been an absolute pleasure. And in just for if anybody who wants to follow you, is the best place Instagram?
Yes, that's right. Yes, I'm only on Instagram in terms of my magical
Mm-hmm.
path. I'm not. I'm not anywhere else on the World Wide Web, at least not under this particular name.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I have been asked why I don't
Mm-hmm.
reveal more of myself. I mean, obviously, at the time of this recording, as we're speaking, you are basically speaking to an image, which I'm so sorry for.
That's all right.
It's just the secrecy is, I mean, this also ties in with the whole Middle East thing. Growing up there, you just didn't talk about certain things
Mm-hmm.
without people becoming suspicious of what you were getting up to. And you could apply that actually to anywhere, but certainly in the Middle East, it could be dangerous. And I
Yes.
don't mean that in a light way.
Mm-hmm.
Sorcery, witchcraft, even conjuring Jinn
Mm-hmm.
are seen as blasphemous and against the will of Allah, especially if you're obviously Islamic or Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
So when you grow up in that environment, you realize that you just don't talk about that sort of thing. You don't even, I mean, you could talk about, uh, your dreams or things like that. Everybody talks about their dreams. But then to start saying, I think I visited somebody in my dream last night and they responded, their soul responded to me. I wouldn't say that.
Yeah.
Certainly, as you probably are very well aware of, especially in countries such as Saudi Arabia, it is a punishable offense, and the penalty is the death sentence. One can actually, in this day and age, be put to death for supposedly witchcraft or sorcerous ways.
Mm-hmm.
It's and for that reason, and many, many more asides, I choose for the moment to not reveal every aspect of my life.
Yeah,
And I think that's important for everybody.
yeah, absolutely. It's sensible. I totally appreciate that, and doubly so appreciate you you coming on the show to talk about your practice and tell us about your experiences and knowledge of the Jinn. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mademoiselle Vendredi. I'm sure you've all been scribbling down notes and are firing up those sigils as we speak. I wish everybody the best in finding love and glamour in their lives. Okay, I hope you all enjoyed that. I particularly enjoyed the stories of the Jinn. As I mentioned earlier, that's the roots of the show. So if you want to find out more about Mademoiselle Vendredi, be sure to check out her Instagram. You can find the links to that below. And I'll leave it there. Talk soon. Take care. Bye.